October 7, 2023. This was the date when the world shuddered, perhaps not less than on February 24, 2022. That day marked a new phase in the long-standing Arab-Israeli conflict that has spanned decades. At the same time, the start of active hostilities between Palestine and Israel shattered many myths for the first time. First and foremost concerning the Merkava tanks. Turns out it's a predatory operation. Aggressive, and in the opinion of many publications, if not the most protected, then one of the most protected cars in the world. But it actually is not. Therefore, so after long journeys across the network, after sifting through gigabytes of information about this Israeli tank, I finally decided to share my impressions and opinions about it with you. And I'll try to do this as objectively as possible, so make yourself comfortable, and let's get acquainted with the legendary merch. Closer! Hope you all enjoy the view. The first 3 decades of its existence, Israel's armored vehicle pack was a mix of various military aid from different sources. Trophies, German reparations, supplies from the United States and everything else. Makes sense, and that's how it is. Since the state only began its existence in 1948, the first steps in tank building naturally involved modernization and repair of anything that came to hand. Thus, the first major project was the upgrade of the existing American M48 and M60 tanks. The cars were collectively named Magda. Israelis replaced engines, mounted new guns, upgraded the fire control system, experimented with armor, and added their own explosive reactive armor modules. In the mid-70s, almost all of the M48 and M60 tanks in Israel were upgraded to the Magaheshu modification. By the way, here a happy Lebanese kid throws a rock at one of them. This photo was taken in 1982, and by then, the Merkava Mark I could have already been in place, which also made its debut in that Lebanese war. This tank immediately proved itself quite well in protecting the crew and evacuating the wounded from the battlefield. In general, Israel decided to develop its own tank back in the 70s, after Britain refused to sell chieftains, to avoid openly quarreling with then unfriendly neighbors of Israel. Yes, Britain was still on good terms with Iran back then. Interestingly, the head of the project was not an engineer, but a certain former commander of the Armored Corps, Major General Israel Tal, who had fought in all the Arab-Israeli wars. He was one of the authors of the Israeli doctrine on the use of armored forces. No wonder why Merkava, which translates as chariot, was fundamentally built with crew protection as its primary principle. A tank, for example, could be fully operational, but it's not. The crew must survive. For this, he placed the engine transmission unit at the front of the hull and used front-wheel drive for the tracks. As an additional protection, he also used the front fuel tanks located right behind the lower front part of the body and another partition. There was also an armored partition between them and the engine transmission department. Another bulkhead. Between them and the MTO itself was also an armored bulkhead, as well as between the MTO and the control compartment. One more advantage of this layout is that the crew could evacuate a damaged vehicle not only through their hatches but also through the rear hull doors, where, thanks to the absence of an engine, it was possible to organize a full-fledged landing party, which could accommodate up to 6 infantrymen wounded and injured. Or load this compartment full of shells. A lot of attention was given to the tanker's convenience. The designers worked off the principle that the tank is the crew's home on the battlefield. Additionally, Tal proposed the rather controversial concept of round-the-clock use of the tank. For this, it was arranged to place 2 crews in one vehicle at once. One rests while the other fights. Back then, combat experience showed that the highest number of hits was on the turret, so its frontal projection needed to be minimized. That's exactly what they did, sinking it deep into the hull. Because of this, a ring of about 20 centimeters in length formed along the edge inside the combat unit, which first of all significantly complicated the work of the charger that, which somehow needed to deliver shells outside the combat compartment. And secondly, someone could simply lose their limbs if they got caught in the gap between the turret and the body during its rotation. Beautiful spinning piece. The turret rotates. If someone sticks their hand or leg in, they'd lose it for good. And the most interesting thing now, thanks to the improved ballistics of the cannons and modern control systems, with fire, it often hits the body rather than the heavily armored turret. But many here complain about the regional aspect. They say that IDF tankers prefer to position themselves at specifically equipped positions located on slopes of elevations. For this reason, the likelihood of hitting the turret is quite high, and therefore, in the Merkava, an attempt was made to position the combat compartment as deep as possible, inside the hull. Okay, let it be that way. But the funny thing is that to have a place to sink the turret, which ultimately protrudes just 80 centimeters above the hull, they had to... It was necessary to increase the height of this very hull. And for what reason did they need to start all this, you might ask? Look at this pipette thing on the right from Merkava. Oh, I think that's an Abrams. The difference between the American and Israeli machines is probably the same as between the Abrams and T-72. The low turret is simply overshadowed by the bulky body, giving the tank a huge silhouette that's very hard to miss. Note that the height of Merkava's hull was 1.86 meters, which is 30 to 40 centimeters taller than the hulls of Abrams or T-72. The height of the Merkava, including the turret, is 2.66 meters, compared to 2.22 on the T-72 or 2.38 on the Abrams. And by the way, 2.48 on the Leopard 2. However, such a hull was also needed to configure the engine and transmission vertically, freeing up additional space at the rear. Inside, as you probably guessed, are 4 crew members. The driver mechanic is on the left because the engine is on the right. The commander follows the gunner on the right side of the combat compartment. The loaders are on the left. Regardless, Merkava tanks participated in all local military conflicts of Israel in southern Lebanon and in policing operations on the west bank of the Jordan River. And of course the Gaza sectors. And they were constantly modernizing, equipping themselves with the most current and relevant technologies. Well, we'll talk about all this a little later. No doubt, the chosen concept led to an unprecedented increase in size and weight of the tank in modern tank building, including its reserved volume, considering the landing unit, which also needs to be somehow protected. The only way out of such a situation is to use relatively thin armor, that is, to save material. In the end, they managed to control the weight somehow, just by the edge. Starting from the third modification, the weight of the Israeli tank reached 63 tons. Mk4 is generally 65 or older, and according to some data, even 70. More than that is simply not possible. No suspension can handle it. And what kind of engine would be needed to move such a behemoth? It is believed that armor accounts for an average of 75% of a tank's combat weight. Based on this, we can calculate the degree of protection, which is the ratio of the weight of the armor to the equipped spaces. The T-90 has an armor weight of 36 tons and a reserved volume of 11.5 cubic meters. That's a protection level of 3.113 tons per cubic meter. The Abrams M1A2 has an armor weight of 47.5 tons, with a behind armor volume of 19.7 cubic meters, 2.42 tons per cubic meter. The reserved volume of the Merkava Mk4 is, at the most modest estimates, twice that of the Merkava 3, at least 23 liters. Cuba, with armor weighing 48.75 tons, we have a figure just over 2 tons per cubic meter. 2.12! The first modifications of the vehicle were protected by simple homogeneous armor, which was a spaced rolled plate. Partitions were installed between different front sections, and the whole principle focused on their overall thickness, the spacing between them, and structural elements inside these niches. Together they provide a cumulative effect for better counteracting the cumulative charge. Fight fire with fire! VLD and UFO. The panels are almost equal in width and height, and are steel sheets with a thickness of 76 mm, but the bottom one is angled at 50 degrees and the top one at 74 degrees. For comparison, the T-72's upper front hull has an inclination of 68 degrees, and NLD is 60. Next was the compartment with the onboard gearbox and other components, behind which was a 60 mm plate inclined at 15 degrees, separating the fuel tank. Another 100 mm vertical plate closing the MTO, followed by the engine itself, behind which stood the last vertical 20 mm plate. The partition is right in front of the combat unit. The same war in Lebanon showed that such protection does not save from the fire of 125 mm guns. That's why Merkava Mk2 appeared. They increased the thickness of some partitions. And for the first time, specialized composite modules appeared, resembling a layered cake made of steel, ceramics, fiberglass, polymers, and who knows what else. The advantage of such screens was that they could be easily removed for transportation. But mainly, what is slat armor? It might not be like that. You could reinvent it countless times, changing its composition and placing it back on the plate. For the same reason, Tal once even said that the Merkava is an eternally young tank, because its external armor is always modern. Therefore, it's hard to definitively say anything about the protection numbers of any Merkava. A lot depends on these modules. Unlike other tanks, whose combined armor is initially built into the hull, but it's not all smooth sailing. The downside of the modules turned out to be even more significant. The thing is, they are attached to the body with simple bolts, which probably won't withstand shelling from any decent gun like a 120 mm cannon. Specifically, that's why a huge number of experts and simply fans of armored vehicles I am very skeptical about Merkava's ability to withstand the firepower of other modern tanks. Overall, everything shown in this video allows us to conclude that the resilience of the Merkava leaves much to be desired. Can it be evaluated in terms of equivalent thickness of homogeneous steel armor? There is not much data on this topic, but I still managed to find some information and come to certain conclusions. The efforts to strengthen the Merkava's protection are truly never-ending. The most current version of the Mk4, according to Israeli sources, has received an additional 100mm module on top of the upper glacis plate. Previously, the outer partition between the engine and transmission compartment and the combat compartment was increased from 20 to 80mm. They replaced the lower frontal plate too. It was 75mm thick. Now it is 80mm. By the way, the engine transmission is generally considered equivalent to 60mm of homogeneous armor. Many also, I must say, dispute this. A shell might simply slip past the engine's solid components. It's not a solid steel cube. Plus, the metal composition in it can be softer than rolled steel. But 60 means 60, we accept it as true. It still won't make things much easier. Considering all the above, the Merkava Mk4's protection in numbers is approximately as follows. The thickness of the upper frontal part, along with the new overlay module, which in this version of the vehicle even covered the notorious hump, is about 180mm. There are many photos online where you can compare the thickness of the upper glacis plate to something like the belt of a nearby soldier. Here's a photo where the cross-section of the Merkava VLD is well visible, and you can clearly compare it to a similar part of the T-64BV. An incline of 74 degrees gives an effective thickness of 300 to 350mm. Adding to this are all the obstacles on the way to the combat unit, including the engine itself. In total, they add another 250mm, so we get 550 to 600mm. At first glance, those numbers don't seem too bad, but remember, to disable the Merkava's movement, a shell only needs to penetrate one lower glacis plate, which bops penetrates 350mm. Yeah, I think almost all of them. And heaven forbid if he hits a high-positioned lower glacis. Even 150 millimeters wouldn't help. And the lower frontal part here, in terms of its geometric dimensions, is essentially equal to the upper frontal part, because behind it are the fuel tanks and the engine. Purely for anti-shrapnel protection. Other tank building schools aim to make the lower glacis plate as small as possible, and with a steep angle, to hide this area behind terrain features. But not with the Merkava, so if you still think the Merkava has good protection, I truly feel sorry for you. You can't get good armor protection numbers in a Merkava with the chosen configuration. 3 fuel tanks are located just behind the central part of the lower frontal hull, and the other 2 in the corners under the engine. Here's a photo of the Merkava's nose section, which has already appeared in a video. This side thickness is impressive, isn't it? Also, take note of the joints with the gearbox. In this photo, the unit is already installed, and the red outlined area will house the fuel tanks. And here is the set of tanks from the nose section. Right behind them, you can see the rest of the tanks from the ISS. In this photo, the latest ones are already in place. Here we can also see the joints of the gearbox and the final drives. And there's the final drive itself, the Merkava tank, which looks like a turret with a set of gears. So, the reducer in the very front of the tank also takes up quite a bit of space. They even had to make a huge cutout in a place that logically should be the most protected. A huge hole clearly does not help with that, and this way the remaining space for armor can be estimated. We have to remember that engines are also placed in the nose. Feels like the space got even bigger. To put it simply, no matter how the Israelis tried, they couldn't increase the protection level to the equivalent of 1000 or more millimeters of homogeneous armor, unless aliens share their extraterrestrial alloys with us.
Other materials...
A somewhat reasonable size of a combine in such a limited space won't fit. And this in such a massive tank as the Merkava. That's why they had to fix the situation with add-on modules. In a way, it actually worked. Tell me, when did Band-Aid Solutions really solve a problem? Moreover, 1000 millimeters from Bob is now a reality for the same Western. Oh,
the Soviet school of tank building.
Talks about the magical Israeli composite armor are just empty chatter. Even the richest army in the world has gone the route of increasing size to tank slightly more damage. And by the way, speaking of thick partitions, take a look at the capsule that Maclopius is in. The thickness of its walls is also fascinating, isn't it? And can we seriously talk about tanking armor-piercing shells? Recently, schematic drawings have started circulating online, where the Chinese have tried to assess the protection of the Merkava. It was about the MK3. Experts from the Middle Kingdom gave it the trace.
More power.
Overall, their assessment is very similar to the one we came to together. With you, based on open source analysis, the Merkava's protection is somewhat on the level of the T-72. Not the best result for a car from the late 90s, early 2000s. Armor can be penetrated by any reasonably modern bobs, or even a serious heat round. A tandem RPG-29 might be enough to immobilize the vehicle, and as practice with the MK3 has shown, it reliably penetrated with an anti-tank guided missile. By the way, the penetration depth of the system is only 600 millimeters, so a mode on none and initiated work on the MK4. Now, let's talk a bit about the turret. Initially, it was protected by 2 layers of spaced cast steel armor, with wall thicknesses of 76 millimeters. On MKT3 and MKT4, they also stopped using carton-welded modules with combined fillers. Thus, the front protection of the MK3 turret was rated by the Chinese at 450 millimeters from bobs. MKT4 added even more due to the larger modules. The thickness in some parts of the cheeks reached 1 meter and 79 centimeters, which is quite substantial. The tower's silhouette became stepped. Therefore, some experts believe that the Israelis managed to achieve the stitch level is within 550 to 600 millimeters. The add-on modules theoretically provide a decent increase in areas outside of the primary angles. They have securely reinforced the sides, stern, and the entire roof, which originally had a clearance of just 20 millimeters. It's actually quite funny. An additional 10 millimeters was welded above the driver's position, and in the MK4, its hatch, as well as the loaders, were completely removed. They are covered with thick plates. To gauge their thickness, just look at the commander's hatch, which turned out so massive that it had to be equipped with an electric drive to move. The lid is almost impossible to handle with bare hands. This leads us to believe that the roof of the Merkava 4 tower has solid protection between 100 and 200 millimeters, and can even withstand some top attack missiles. Rocket, or so it seems. That's what the calculation was based on anyway. And this is even without involving the grill, which recently, by the way, have started appearing en masse in the Israeli army. I'll point this out to everyone who laughed at the visors on the Teshkas, and they actually have top quality factory production here. Additionally, the gun mantelet, a common weak spot, is also covered by a module, generally offering 200 to 300 millimeters of protection. The bottom is quite thin. The armor here is just 15 millimeters, while in the Soviet model it is 20 to 30, while the Abrams has between 12.5 and 32 millimeters depending on the body area. The Israelis saved on armor here too, but the Merkava's hull bottom is V-shaped, and it is made of two steel sheets, the upper and lower compartments, between which fuel was poured. It was believed that such an unusual tank could further enhance the crew's protection against explosions. But with the MK3, they didn't pour fuel in here. It turned out that the shock pulse transmits through air weaker than through liquid. And in MK4, closer to the flask, they boiled another leaf. That's why the clearance was reduced from a significant 530 to a pretty unimpressive 430 millimeters. The thickness of the hull sides is 35 millimeters, which generally corresponds to the standards of the Western school. On the forum, Odvaga once even surfaced a photo of a blown-up Merkava, where the thickness of the sides with the rear press was visible, somewhere around just 2/3 of the diameter of the stoplight. That is if you estimate again, not more than those same 40 millimeters. Compared to the 80 millimeter sides of Soviet cars. Ridiculous. I know, just like Americans do. The Israelis tried to fix this. At first they welded plates onto their hulls and added screens with steel thicknesses up to 7 centimeters. The sides of the Merkava are also covered with screens, but they are no less than 15 centimeters thick. You can see this in the photo, where the rear side screen, which is likely thinner than those at the front, is compared to a pack of cigarettes. Additionally, provision is made for mounting dynamic protection blocks on screens, which are suspended on steel leaf springs to reduce the chances of damage during movement. In short, the side protection is whatever it is, but again, depending on how the screens perform, they might even hold fragments of 152 to 155 mm large caliber shells. Now a few words about the driver's protection. They sit in a separate armored capsule, shielding them from engine fires, though it might not hold up against something more serious. This thin shell won't hold up to anything serious. It's not protected by the engine or transmission. Right behind it is the combat compartment. That's why the left zone in the Merkava's front is traditionally considered weakened. In the airborne unit, there's also effective bulletproof protection. It turned out that the same RPG, or, God forbid, a thermobaric round can initiate the detonation of the ammunition if it's there. That's why they shut down this place too. Fuel tanks and a slightly armored wrapping. For this, they even placed the filter ventilation unit in the feed niche of the tower, while the battery is in the overtrack niche. But the door to the aft section, no matter what you say, is massive, with a width of 60 centimeters, made in the form of two panels, both upper and lower. The lower one, which also doubles as a ramp. but the main drawback is protected.
Accuracy and prudence.
The main issue lies in a fundamental principle established when choosing the prototype, namely, the decision to use the engine as a component of protection. This substituted the concept of tank protection with the concept of crew protection by placing a vital component in the line of fire. It's the same as covering your head from a bullet with your heart. This ignores one of the mandatory requirements of the combat vehicle design specifications. It's your move.
That's how it is.
Even if the enemy's projectile gets stuck in the MTO, not reaching the combat compartment, the crew has no choice but to abandon the tank and flee the battlefield. Also, the front engine layout dragged along an eggshell instead of armor. Merkava should avoid encounters with any modern tank. It is deadly dangerous for it, especially if the opponent, God forbid, shoots first. Bops with a penetration of 700 mm are already in service, probably with everyone. Turns out to be a funny detail. At distances over 2 kilometers, the Merkava cannot penetrate the armor of the T-90, Abrams, or Leopard, but they can definitely hit the Merkava 100% within 3 kilometers or more. And one more thing, over long distances, it's substantial.
influence is increasing.
The thermal flow from the front-mounted engine affects the clarity of the target image in the Merkava's sight, located just to the right of the gun. So, the crew often needs to turn the tank chassis by 20 degrees or more to the left from the direction of the gun's horizontal aim. Meanwhile, the front of the body protected by the engine moves aside, exposing its lightly armored side in a deadly duel. Overall, it's another reason why the Merkava is best not to engage with other tanks. However, its layered pie of spaced barriers provides really good protection, probably from all types of cumulative means. Counting it precisely is quite difficult, but experts assume that to reach the crew, a cumulative warhead should penetrate at least 1.5 meters through the frontal armor, which is on par with the best anti-tank guided missiles. But again, notice that it speaks about the protection of the crew, not the entire vehicle. As the head of Rostec, Alexei Chemezov, said at the end of last year, Merkava, nothing more than a product of Israeli military industry's advertising, which in practice turned out to be quite vulnerable, with just basic armor protection. That of a heavy infantry fighting vehicle with tank armament. A sort of hybrid for Middle Eastern combat scenarios. And his opinion is far from unfounded, and is supported by many, including perhaps even myself. In the next video, we will talk about the firepower and mobility of the Merkava. And under this one, don't forget to like and leave a comment.
your
The
position.
poet's feedback and comments are almost sage-like. We confirmed this ambiguous machine. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and see you soon in the next part of the Merkava video.